Good afternoon. My name is David Sears, and I want to thank the Friends of the World War II Memorial for having me on this presentation. During the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about a book I wrote called At War with the Wind, the epic battle with Japanese kamikaze pilots. It's a book that I actually was published in 2008, so there's some history behind it. And actually, I want to start by pointing to the first book I wrote and give you a little bit of background about me. I've come kind of late to the area of World War II history. I began my career as a U.S. naval officer, and I was in service for 4 years during the Vietnam era. And 2 of those years were spent on a U.S. Navy destroyer. So I have a real affinity, do have an affinity for that type of service in the U.S. Navy. But I was in the Navy 4 years early in my career, then went on to a longer career in corporate management. And so I come to history, naval history, basically over the last 20 years. And interestingly, my first book, which I'd like to point to, it's called The Last Epic Naval Battle, Voices from Leyte Gulf. That was actually about the Battle of Leyte Gulf and actually the prelude to the kamikaze offensive. So in doing that book, this was written in 2004, so it was the 60th anniversary of the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. And the approach I took was to locate 60 veterans. Some of them were sailors, some of them were airmen, some of them were, I believe, soldiers on the ground, and get their version of what happened to them during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Now, the one person that kind of introduced me to the kamikaze concept, I mean, I was familiar with it, but didn't realize its origin, was a sailor aboard the USS St. Lo. His name is Evan Hawley Crawford. I'm going to talk a little bit about his experience, but first I want to show you a short video. Back in 2006, I was asked to be a commentator on a series called Dogfights, and they did a special episode on the kamikaze experience. I had just finished the last epic naval battle and was doing research and writing for At War with the Wind. So this was kind of an ideal time for me to both learn about the kamikaze experience, but also to give you to give the audience my perspective on what the veterans I talked to had seen.
USS St. Lo was the first American ship sunk by kamikazes. A hideous scenario that will be repeated nearly 3,000 times before the war's end, claiming 5,000 lives.
So, Hawley was a sailor aboard the USS St. Lo, and it's important to understand that the St. Lo was was called an escort carrier, and these were a series of carriers. There were about 50 or so of them that were constructed to support amphibious invasions. You didn't have to tie down a big fleet carrier. These light carriers or escort carriers would do the job in supporting the Marines and Army as they invaded islands in the Pacific. So he was originally from Nevada. He was originally also turned down for Navy service because he was very nearsighted. He was turned down until they learned that he was an electrician's apprentice and they desperately needed skills in electronics. So he became a radar and radio technician, and actually his first exposure to World War II was in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. They actually interrupted his training in electronics and shipped him out to the Pacific to be on board the USS Enterprise during the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands, which was part of the Guadalcanal campaign. Now, he was stationed right under the flight deck when this crash occurred, and he ran up to the flight deck. There were wounded and killed everywhere. They were putting life jackets on the wounded and attempting to lower them by ropes into the water. Eventually, they had to give up on doing that, and he ran to a rope himself. He started to climb down off the ship into the water. Somebody stepped on his shoulders, and he ended up in the water without a life preserver. He eventually got one, and a lot of the sailors from the St. Lo were saved by I believe it was an escort destroyer called the USS Dennis. There were so many on board the Dennis, and the Dennis itself had received some damage from the Battle of Leyte Gulf, that the Dennis itself started to sink, and the captain had to put out the word to the people on board that we've rescued you, but if you want to stay on a ship that's afloat, you're going to have to lend a hand and help us bail water before we sink ourselves. So it was a pretty traumatic experience for him, but he was really the first time I'd learned that kamikazes were in effect during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The last epic naval battle, I made it a point to interview as many veterans as I could. I thought that I'd been in the Navy myself, and I knew that it was good to get as many perspectives on this battle as I could. So I'd interviewed 60 veterans. Now, at War with the Wind, I kind of let myself loose, and honestly, this was a time in 2005 and 2006, and 2007, where you could, through veterans associations and reunions and online websites, you could find these veterans. And I interviewed, I think it was about 300. Now, in each 300 veterans, that's something you obviously can't do now. And in interviewing them, I was not so much concerned, I was not trying to have them tell me the history of of World War II and the kamikazes. I wanted to get their personal, what had happened to them, what they'd seen, what they'd experienced, and what they thought now. And it was a very informative and exciting way for me to have this information. The history was readily at hand, but to have these stories from about 300 veterans really contributed to the essence of At War with the Wind. I want to give you a quick background on how it is in the Pacific, World War II in the Pacific, how the Japanese got to the point of feeling compelled that they had to use suicide bombers to defend themselves. I want to say, first of all, there's an emphasis on suicide bombers, but there really wasn't a tradition in the Japanese Navy of using suicide. What there was a tradition of never surrendering. And so when you get to the point where defeat seems obvious, it's easy, or at least reasonable, to persuade your aviators that this is a case of not surrendering. All right, so let's look at a little background here. The war in the Pacific begins in 1942, and the headline events from 1942 are the carrier battles, the Coral Sea, and the Battle of Midway in June 1942, and then the invasion of Guadalcanal in August of 1942. Those were the major headline events, and the consequences of those for the Japanese Navy were loss of resources. If you want to tell the simplest story of the kamikaze experience, it's a case of the Japanese Navy losing aircraft carriers, losing aircraft, probably most important, losing experienced combat pilots, and I guess finally losing their access to resources, primarily fuel. So it was all about the Japanese losing these resources and the United States Navy gaining these resources as the war went on. So in 1942, it's the Battle of Midway, Battle of Coral Sea, and Guadalcanal. Lots of the Japanese carriers were put out of action. They lost a lot of pilots and a lot of aircraft. Now, in 1943, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Marines go on the offensive. There are two main offenses in the Pacific. The one I've been most concerned with is the Central Pacific Campaign. It's a series of island-hopping missions on the way from the Gilbert Islands, which you can see sort of in the center, moving on to the Marshall Islands, moving on to the Marianas, and eventually on towards Okinawa. Now, this was a campaign largely orchestrated by the U.S. Navy and using the U.S. Marines to attack island targets, to make quick and bloody assaults, to capture them quickly, and then move hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles onto the next objective. And the Navy was very concerned that these island conquests happened very quickly, so that the supporting armadas, the amphibious craft, the aircraft carriers, and again, this is where the escort carriers come in. And the escort ships, destroyers and such ships, are kept away from Japanese aircraft. So the idea was to have a quick invasion, taking heavy casualties quite often, but then conquering the island within a matter of days, sometimes hours, and then moving on to the objective, hopping on to the next objective on the way to Japan. What's labeled here as the South Pacific, I would name that Southwest Pacific campaign, was orchestrated by Douglas MacArthur. It was using U.S. Navy resources, but also primarily using U.S. Army resources. Now this begins after the conquest of Guadalcanal, moving west for various land offenses on the big island of New Guinea. And now these were conducted by U.S. Army forces, bigger land masses, more conducive to strategic offensives as opposed to lightning quick offenses, but a series of landings and conquests in the islands of New Guinea on their way to the Philippines. Now you can see from the slide, as you get, in the case of the Americans, to the Mariana Islands, and in the case of the Southwest Pacific campaign, getting close to the Philippines, you're getting within, you're certainly threatening the Japanese main islands. Now, the Japanese had always looked to have a strategic battle to decide who was going to control the Pacific. This was big ships, primarily now carrier ships, that would go out to engage the U.S. Navy and to have an all-out battle. Now, this happened on two occasions. In June of 1944, when the Marines and some Army troops as well invaded Saipan, this was a signal to Japan that the war in the Pacific was really hung in the balance. And this invasion occurred in June 1944, and in response, the Japanese Navy sent out its big task forces to confront the American fleet in and around the island of Saipan. And in June of 1944, there was a huge battle, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. And like most sea battles in the Pacific, it was a carrier battle. And during this battle, there was an event called the Marianas Turkey Shoot, which basically evolved into a slaughter of many Japanese pilots and planes. I think the number of Japanese planes was roughly in the 300s that were lost. And not just the planes, but the experienced Japanese combat pilots. Remember, the Battle of the Philippine Sea is in June of 1944. The invasion of Leyte, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, or the invasion of the Philippines at Leyte, which is one of the sub-islands of the Philippines, was in October 1944, so several months after the Battle of the Philippine Sea. And here, the Japanese are still occupying the Philippines. They have land-based aircraft. And they, again, sortie their ships, very complicated maneuvers, trying to take on the American fleet, supporting the invasion of Leyte Gulf. And once again, they got defeated. And with aerial resources able to fly from the Philippine Islands, they finally made the decision to use kamikaze aircraft. So that was kind of the setting for what happened to the St. Lo. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Sea Battle of Leyte Gulf, had been lost. The Americans were ashore in Leyte Gulf, and the only choice the Japanese had were to attempt suicide attacks. So from October of 1945 through to the end of World War II in the Pacific, the Japanese are using suicide tactics. I want to turn next to another video snippet, which gives a little bit of background on the Japanese decision-making to use these type of tactics.
The concept was originally rejected as defeatist, but with the Allied invasion of the Philippines, the decision is made to unleash the suicide weapon. The goal is to inflict sufficient casualties to destroy the Americans' will to fight. The new strategy is called Toko. The success of the initial kamikaze mission on October 25, 1944, unleashes a tidal wave of attacks. The Navy and Army High Command draft inexperienced pilots into practically any flyable airplane. By the time of the Okinawa invasion in April 1945, massive kamikaze raids are bringing a glimmer of hope to Japan's desperate situation.
The one thing I would add to this video is that there was not really a suicide ethos in the Japanese armed forces. I think I've said this before. There was, however, an ethos of never surrendering. And when presented with the situation, Japanese pilots, many but not all of them volunteers, were persuaded to use these tactics as an example of never surrendering to an oncoming enemy, protecting your homeland. It was not a case of sacrificing your life for nothing, but it was part of the Bushido Code, the warrior code of Japan, never to surrender. The Battle of the Philippine Sea and the Battle of Leyte Gulf are now behind us, and the Central Campaign has made its way to the conquest of Saipan. It's gone on to Iwo Jima. MacArthur's forces are ashore in the Philippines, moving through the islands, and we're getting closer and closer to the Japanese homeland and to areas that are still occupied by Japan, like the island of Formosa, which is now Taiwan. And it becomes more realistic for the Japanese to use kamikaze tactics. And it's tactically possible because the pilots involved are really not well trained. They don't have the good aircraft that they used to have. They have limited fuel resources. And with their limited training, they, for example, aren't able to take off and land on carriers. They're basically able to take off and probably not that skilled at landing and not that skilled at navigating their way to make these attacks. So the closer the Americans get to Japan, the more desperate the Japanese situation is, obviously, but also the more likely it is to be able to use inexperienced pilots, pilot trainees who have been persuaded that it's important to never surrender and to sacrifice themselves, and in doing so, to take out major ships. We get to the island of Okinawa. Now, this is in April of 1945, and the Americans from both the Southwest Pacific Campaign and the Central Pacific Campaign are moving in towards the Japanese islands. And we reach the invasion of Okinawa. And this is where these two offensive campaigns kind of converge. The Central Pacific Campaign and the Southwest Pacific Campaign converge. Okinawa basically is a part of the Japanese homeland. It's very close. It's within flying range. It's a large island. And although the invaders are both U.S. Marines and U.S. Army, they are under U.S. Army command. And that means a different strategic approach to conquering the island. Heavier use of artillery, less use of frontline assault, more maneuvering. It's a slower process run by an Army general. And that created concern with the Navy because when it takes a while to conquer an island, all the supporting ships, the supply ships, the amphibious ships, the escort carriers, and their aircraft have to stay close to the situation, and they become more and more exposed. Now, these attacks, these kamikaze attacks, ended up being on all kinds of ships, because another lack of experience the would-be kamikaze pilots had was that they weren't too good at identifying a carrier versus a battleship versus a cruiser versus a destroyer versus a supply ship. So they end up attacking the first ship that they see. And the counter strategy was to set up a series of radar picket stations. You'll see that in the upper left-hand corner of this slide. And the station to focus on is Radar Picket Station 1, RP1. We're very shortly going to show you a clip of the attack on the USS Laffey, a destroyer. And interestingly, to me at least, I was stationed on what was actually a vestige of a World War II destroyer. And many of the armaments, especially the guns of a destroyer, were the guns that I was responsible for, learned how to shoot when I was on a Navy destroyer. So it had a real resonance for me. Now, at these radar picket stations were primarily U.S. Navy destroyers. The best of them were Fletcher-class destroyers that came on with the fleet carriers in 1943 and 1944. They would typically be paired up with an amphibious craft, an LCS, landing craft support, which was basically a gunship, a smaller amphibious, shallow-bottom craft that would accompany the destroyer. And basically, the logic was that if the destroyers attacked and sunk, the LCS, the landing craft support, is going to be around to pick up the survivors. They had aircraft carriers sort of nearby, but there was a lot of land-based U.S. Marine aircraft, and each of the destroyer pickets typically had a fighter director team, a special radar team that would be able to communicate with the combat air patrols to help them coordinate and to go where they were needed. Now, obviously, this is a series of stations, these radar picket stations that surround the entirety of Okinawa, but it's basically RP-14, RP-1, RP-2, and RP-3 that take the brunt of the Japanese attacks. So now we're going to take a look at one of the most dramatic attacks, the kamikaze attacks, that I spent a lot of time analyzing and doing the narrative for this in my book, At War with the Wind, and interviewed a number of survivors. But this is the USS Laffey. The day is April 16th, 1945, and it's the ship, as I say, the type of destroyer that I'm familiar with, was about to be attacked by multiple kamikazes stationed at Radar Picket Station 1.
April 16, 1945, the destroyer USS Laffey, accompanied by support ships LCS-51 and 116, is patrolling waters 50 miles north of Okinawa. The ship is on radar picket duty, a new defensive tactic that positions a ring of destroyers around the main invasion force to create an early warning system against incoming aircraft. Laffey is manning station number 1, the closest to Japan. The last 4 destroyers to patrol this area were slammed by kamikazes. Ari Futridis is a 19-year-old quartermaster on Laffey.
We knew that being the first in the line of defense was dangerous, but we didn't realize to what extent.
At 7:44 a.m., radar picks up a solitary Val dive bomber 6 miles out, approaching off the port bow. Laffey's 5-inch guns quickly open fire. At 3 miles, the Val jettisons its bomb and turns away.
Probably came in just to look over the situation and then took off.
Then, at 8:29 a.m., a swarm of 50 Japanese planes appears on the horizon. The attackers circle ominously, like vultures. The USS Laffey is about to face the most unrelenting kamikaze attack in history. The swarm includes Val and Judy dive bombers and Cape torpedo planes. Older aircraft equipped for suicide attack.
These were outmoded aircraft. They could be loaded with explosives. They were relatively easy to fly and stable platforms for doing what they had to do, which is to aim at a ship and try to hit it.
Suddenly, 4 Vals break formation and bear down on Laffey. 2 head for the starboard bow. Captain Julius Beckton orders Laffey to come about hard left 30 degrees to bring all his guns broadside to the attackers. Laffey unleashes an anti-aircraft barrage. Laffey splashes the first two attackers, but the other two valves wheel around to come in from the stern. One valve sheds pieces of fuselage until its fixed landing gear catches the water. Tracers converge on the second valve. Laffey is barely spared a moment's respite before a Judy screams in from 90 degrees to starboard. Judys are a fast dive bomber, top speed 340 miles per hour. But this one's heading in at a poor attack angle. All of Laffey's guns can train their fire on the kamikaze. But immediately another Judy barrels in on the opposite side. The destroyer's top speed is 35 knots, and it can turn sharply. Captain Becton orders 30 degrees hard right rudder. The Judy is no match for Laffey's main battery. The aircraft disintegrates. But its bomb detonates in the water, spewing killing shrapnel over exposed areas of the ship. Planes are coming in from every angle, using specialized tactics developed over months of experience. The ideal TOCO mission can muster enough kamikazes to use all approach tactics together. Precisely what Laffey is facing now. At 8:39 a.m., a Val approaches from the port side, directly amidships. Laffey maneuvers violently to throw off the pilot's aim. Laffey now presents a smaller target. The ship is 377 feet long, but only 41 feet wide. It's as if Laffey is in the dogfight with the kamikaze. WWII hits home, but the Val's momentum carries him in. It's a glancing blow, but the plane's ruptured gas tanks spew a lethal arc of combustible fuel. Then a ninth kamikaze bores in. The Val approaches at wavetop level, too low an angle for the main gun battery. The plane rips into a 20mm gun mount amidships, killing 3 men. Another Val approaches dead astern, obscured by the billowing smoke. The carnage reaches below decks. Crewmen enveloped in flames race topside. At 8:47, 17 minutes into the attack, gun mount 53 takes a direct hit. The Val's engine lodges in the 5-inch gun, knocking it out. Aviation fuel engulfs the gun mount and ignites.
It seemed like a constant pattern of attack. In fact, at one point, I remember thinking to myself, my God, will this never end?
But another Val is lining up high astern, drawn to the raging fires like a shark to blood. The ship takes evasive action and swings hard to port. This Val is making a bomb run. Kamikaze formations were often accompanied by conventional bombers. A single 500-pound bomb hits the destroyer, jamming the rudder 26 degrees to port. Fires are raging. Steering is damaged. Laffey is fading fast. There are still over 40 kamikazes attacking Laffey. The massive formations ensure some suicide planes will get through.
It's like a swarm of mosquitoes. You can kill a lot of them, you can kill them easily, but if there are enough mosquitoes, one's going to bite you.
Laffey has now been struck by 5 kamikazes and taken 3 bomb hits.
The skipper sent me down to get an assessment of the damage back aft. And then I saw what these planes had done. I saw the gun mounts. I saw that there were fires. I saw a lot of human carnage. I think I might have been in a state of shock when you see things like that.
When a crewman suggests throwing in the towel, Captain Becton responds with indignation. "I will not abandon ship as long as a single gun can fire." Then, just as all seemed lost, a dozen American Corsair fighters roar in. They are the last hope for the burning Laffey.
The Corsair had a clear advantage over any Japanese aircraft. High speed, tough, very maneuverable, take a lot of punishment.
Time and again, the Corsair pilots risked their own lives, chasing the kamikazes down through Laffey's unceasing anti-aircraft fire. Suddenly, a bow looms menacingly towards the bridge, R.A. Petriti's battle station.
It was very vivid in my mind. There was a huge bomb under his belly. And as he approached, the bomb got bigger and bigger and bigger. And I really felt at that point that was going to be a statistic.
But at the last second, gun mount 52 traverses from port to starboard.
He hit the plane directly on the nose, then it disintegrated. That I remember very vividly.
Finally, the 22nd and last attacker, a Judy, streaks in. The Corsair blasts the kamikaze before it could strike the ship. Now, only the roar of the Corsair's 2,000 horsepower engines fill the sky. After 80 minutes of non-stop combat, 6 kamikaze strikes, and 4 bomb hits, incredibly, Laffey is still afloat. Of a crew of 355, 32 men have died and 71 more are wounded. But the destroyer will survive to fight another day.
I think there were several factors involved in our survival. I always point to the competency of our commanding officer and the way he maneuvered the ship during the attack. There was the Combat Air Patrol, which helped us out. Our crew was a brave crew, especially the gunners. And finally, I am convinced in my own mind that we had a little help from above.
This graphic, just to reinforce what you've seen on the video, shows the extent and of the attacks as they occurred during this roughly 80-minute period. And this occupied a substantial portion of At War with the Wind, trying to explain and understand how these attacks had occurred and how the ship, which is shown in the right panel here, how it survived these attacks and actually went on to additional service in the U.S. Navy. So during the course of this period from October of 1944 to August of 1945, 5,000 naval personnel were killed in and around Okinawa. Overall, kamikaze attacks resulted in the deaths of 7,000 Allied naval personnel. And the kamikazes sank in total, only one carrier, but they did sink a total of 34 ships, and 32 of those ships were sunk during the Battle of Okinawa. For their part, the Japanese lost about 3,000 aircraft, and with them, about the same number of kamikaze pilots. I think it's interesting to note that roughly 20% of would-be kamikazes actually succeeded in hitting an American or British warship, Allied warship, and a quarter to a third of the kamikaze flights never even made it to their intended target. So there was a disproportionate loss of U.S. Navy and British Navy personnel, and usually in these island invasions, it would be the Marines or the Army that would take the most casualties. In the case of Okinawa, it was actually the Navy that suffered the worst consequence of that Allied invasion. I think it's of interest that the last American ship to be attacked by a kamikaze was a ship named the USS Bory, DD-704. This occurred on August 9th, 1945, which happened to be the same day as the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, so very, very near the end of the war. There were 48 Navy personnel killed and another 66 wounded. The Bory, this latest Bory, was the namesake for an earlier Bory, the USS Bory DD-215, which is the subject of my latest book, Duel in the Deep, which is the story of the battle between the USS Bory, the older Bory, in October 1943, actually on Halloween Eve 1943, with a German U-boat U-405. So there's always a connection. In this case, the sinking of the older Bory resulted in the commissioning of the newer Bory, and it had its own fateful day during the kamikaze experience. So that concludes my presentation. I hope I've been able to provide some interesting and useful information about the kamikaze experience during World War II. And now I'd very much enjoy hearing some of your questions and trying to respond to them. Thank you very much.
Hi, David. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Alex?
Good. Where are you joining us from?
From the great state of New Jersey.
Which I love, by the way. I spent an entire.
You better love us.
Yeah, oh my God.
Here.
How can I say anything else? But I spent a whole week in your beautiful, beautiful Garden State.
Garden State.
And all of it looks like a garden. It's the most.
Well, there are certain places that don't, but we don't talk about those.
Well, what a wonderful presentation. I love the video, etc. And I wanted to fire through a few questions because we have.
Before you begin, I want to extend some kudos to your digital magician, Max Accione. He took what was a 45-minute video, got it down to a manageable 12 to 15 minutes. And he took a presentation from a rambling author and made it at least reasonably cogent. So I want to thank him, and I want to thank you for having me. I'm a great admirer of your writing, and I would say admiring, bordering on envy and jealousy.
Wow, how straightforward are you? You can come back anytime. You can say exactly that. Without going on too much, though, I do appreciate you calling out Max. He doesn't get enough thanks. I don't think I've ever thanked him while we're doing a show, which is much to my great disgrace. Really is an incredibly important part of our team, and he's the reason why we can get together once a month and why these presentations, apart from the authors, look so awesome. So big round of applause to Max. I know he's going to be blushing now, but he more than deserves to be called out. And thank you, David, for doing that, because I felt very guilty about not thanking him enough at the end of these shows. First question from Jody. Were you able to talk to any of the pilots who trained as kamikaze trainees who did not fly? Have you actually been able to meet someone that was a kamikaze pilot?
The answer is no. I mean, right. This was my second book, still gaining experience in historical resources. For an account of written by an American author who lives in Japan, oh boy, I think his last name is Sheftel, and he wrote Blossoms in the Wind, which really gives the Japanese perspective. firsthand Japanese perspective. I did include Japanese stories, but they were from secondary resources, not firsthand.
Blossoms in the Wind, that says everything you need to know about the dedication to death of the enemy in the Pacific in World War II. I want to read just quickly from your fabulous book. I really do think everybody should read this because it's not only a story of heroism and tragedy and of the kamikazes, but it's also a story of the last months of World War II in the Pacific. I think you do a really great job of contextualizing the kamikaze war with the broader strokes of those fatal last months in the Pacific in World War II. But you do say here, the sailors, airmen, and soldiers who battled Japanese kamikazes faced a gruesome challenge. How could warriors eager to live possibly contend with the fanaticism of opponents committed to die? Now, I'd like you to talk about that a little bit, but I'd also like to add, surely this is why we had to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan.
Well, that's certainly a factor. I mean, the context of this is it's so near not just the end of the war in the Pacific, but obviously victory in Europe has already occurred. So a lot of these sailors had spent their entire military careers on a ship. I mean, there was no rotating to a shore duty, or if anything, they would rotate among ships. So it's been a long war for them, and they see the end coming. So it's particularly distressing, confusing to have to confront enemies who are bent on killing themselves when the only thing you're hoping to do is survive and get home. I think, there was a fair amount of fatalism among American sailors, some joking, there always is, but a real concern that we got to pull together and stay alive as long as we can to get to the end of the war.
We have a question here. What do you think would be the most terrifying aspect of being on a ship targeted by kamikazes?
Oh, I guess seeing it coming straight towards you. I mean, the proximity of it. I mean, in the Navy, this was a carrier war. There weren't ships fighting ships for the most part. But here's a case, especially for these smaller craft, where their enemy is coming right after you. And, we focused in this presentation on the radar picket stations, but the same thing was going on in the harbors and inlets around Okinawa, destroyer escorts, amphibious ships, supply ships. The proximity of death for the first time and for a long time was really central to the life of a sailor off Okinawa.
Yeah, I had the privilege a couple of years ago of interviewing a wonderful woman who'd served as a nurse in the Pacific, and she was on a hospital ship called the USS Comfort, and actually that was hit by a kamikaze aiming straight for the central stack, and that's the largest number of American women killed to date in one incident in combat. Nurses on a hospital ship, clearly marked by red crosses, the subject of kamikaze attacks. It's extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, it's these attacks ended up being pretty indiscriminate. I said, and I believe that these pilots that went out on these missions, I mean, they went en masse. They were escorted quite often by more experienced pilots, but they tended to dive at the first ship that they got within range of, and that would include a hospital ship. So I'm not so sure about the intentionality of that. I think it's a question of desperation. Going back to the sailors' attitude, there was they had a kind of cynical approach to this. I know that on one ship, in one, maybe it was RP1, that had a very big sign saying, Japanese airmen, don't stop here, bigger fleet behind us.
I just want to ask you about the tactics used by the kamikaze pilots because they varied. In reading your book, that was one of the most fascinating aspects of it. How do you basically kill yourself and take as many Americans with you as possible? I think there were something like 7,000 Allied naval personnel who were killed in kamikaze attacks. But what were the basic tactics? How did you stand the best chance of killing yourself while killing others as a kamikaze pilot?
There were two general approaches. One was to come in low over the water, and a main reason for that is that a lot of the main batteries on these destroyers, for example, could only aim so low. So one approach was to come straight in at water level. You'll notice in the video that a lot of the Japanese planes had fixed landing gear, and that itself, contributed to some premature crashes. The other was to come in low and then climb and then dive. So there were these tactics, but you got to understand that we're talking about very inexperienced pilots. So, young pilots about to kill themselves, how much attention are they paying to tactics? They just want to get in and do as much damage as they can. So it's one thing to say they had these different tactical approaches. I think in practice, like in any battle, all the pre-agreed tactics you're going to use go out the window as you're actually contemplating a crash.
Would you agree that the greater impact of the kamikaze campaign was to psychologically terrorize the enemy? I mean, do you think that was the greater impact?
Yeah, well, I know that was the attempted impact. I mean, I think the Japanese knew as early as the end of 1942 that they were not going to win the war. They weren't going to be the victors, but they were hoping to persuade the Allies that the cost would be so great that they'd come to terms. You asked about the atomic bomb and the impact of kamikaze. Certainly that was one factor. I think that intelligence had it that there were 5,000 kamikaze aircraft being held in reserve on the main islands. There was a sense that if Okinawa was that costly, how much more costly would be a land invasion? And what are your options? Do you take heavy casualties and what's the American public going to think of that? And what are your options? And obviously, one of the options was the atomic bomb.
We have a question here from Mike. To what degree did the armored flight decks of the British carriers mitigate kamikaze damage?
Yeah, good point. They did. All the American carriers had wooden decks, and it made them much more susceptible to the damage from crashes. The British had, I assume, steel decks, and the kamikazes could hit, but more likely to bounce off. But I will say that the American carriers, especially the fleet carriers, were even despite the kamikaze attacks, were able to get back flying aircraft relatively soon. I mean, the efforts by the sailors were just heroic in making sure that we'll absorb these hits, but we'll get back into action as soon as possible. And again, the St. Lo, an escort carrier, was the only carrier sunk during this process. All the others survived in one form or another.
So when you were researching your book, what did you learn about the Japanese philosophy of war that surprised you or that you hadn't realized before?
Well, I think that I've learned this began to learn this with that War with the Wind and have learned it more deeply subsequently. This whole business of the divine wind, that suggested this was ancient Japanese history, and it's something we're going to call forth again for the modern era. The idea of samurai and bushido ended up, it was something that was revived in the 30s as Japan became more and more militaristic. There was a departure from what had been the evolution of a democratic process into a military autocracy. And to support that military autocracy, they revived the idea of the samurai warrior, the Bushido code, doing everything you can, including giving your life rather than surrendering. So I think, there was an ancient portion to it, but it was a revival as Japan became more militarily focused in the 1930s.
Do you think it was part of a broader corruption of those ancient spiritual practices and that part of Japanese culture which is still there to be revered? Do you think it was a really cynical corruption of that?
Yes and no. I mean, I think the Japanese militarists saw it as a way of rallying the population, a population that was, frankly, ready to be a less diverse population, a single ethnicity, a chance to rally them around what they were doing, but also cynical in the sense that there was not really that continuity between the samurai era and the modern era. It was, brought back for cynical purposes.
So I understand that you you were researching this book in the period after 9/11. Is that true?
Yeah, in fact, I didn't make this in my presentation, but an introduction to the book was the experience of the USS Cole in 2000. I think I connected that to the USS Lindsay, which was a destroyer that was severely hit and brought into a harbor near Okinawa. Comparing those two experiences, and the attack on the St. Lo, for example, occurred in October 1944. That was the prelude to the kamikaze offensive in 1945, sort of in the way that the attack on the USS Cole, which was in October 2000, was a prelude and a warning about the oncoming effects of 9/11. It was like, pay attention to this because there's more coming.
But isn't one of the lessons from World War II that you can defeat terrorists and fanatics who are prepared to become, for example, kamikaze pilots? You can defeat them through having a very strong, prepared military, by being relentless, by constantly engaging with them, and by never, ever giving up in terms of destroying the enemy. Surely that's the lesson since 9/11. We've achieved that, just as we did in the Pacific in World War II.
Yeah, I think there's an even better lesson for that for both sides in World War II. Either side, the Allies or the Axis, thought that they could shift public opinion by using disastrous tactics, that it would wear down the enemy and that they would be more willing either to surrender or come to terms. And by and large, certainly during World War II, that didn't happen for either side. I mean, the end result is that you have to defeat the enemy forces, that you're not going to shift American or German or Japanese opinion by wild tactics. It's just not going to happen. People are going to dig in and be more supportive than they are saying, I don't want to deal with that. Let's come to terms.
Um, I dare to say, I dare to say it, but I'm going to say it anyway. But the only way to prevail with people who want to kill you is to kill them first.
Yes, I mean that's I would put some context around that, but I would generally agree with if you're looking for a simple straight line answer, that answer is yes. There's more context to it, but yes, I agree.
Thank you. I just want to ask you, what is your own fascination with World War II? What do you really enjoy about writing about this great subject?
Yeah, let me tell you how I came to it. It's really kind of interesting. I grew up in a small town, and what are your feelings about Massachusetts? You like Massachusetts?
I lived there for 7 years.
Okay, all right, all right. I grew up
It's
in a
okay.
very small town in Massachusetts, a small enough town where they would have an annual town meeting of all the
Sure.
citizens to decide the policies over the next year. I think there were maybe 600 people in the town. And my mother happened to be the town clerk. And each year there was an annual report, and they were distributed, and a lot of them ended up in our attic, the house I lived in. And I came across the annual report for 1945. And like many towns, they commemorated all the citizens that had fought or served in World War II. And from a population of 600, there were 70 that had served in the military. And that just fascinated me. I'm maybe 12 or 13 now. No, probably younger than that. These were people I knew, the school bus driver, the local electrician, the local politician, everybody. And that kind of ignited my fascination with World War II and a situation where that was so serious and dire that people would come together and do their part. And that still grips me today as I write about World War II. These were largely a citizen Army, Navy, and Air Force that, the expression is from that movie, the best years of our lives were dedicated to defeating an imminent threat. And then when it was over, we went back to our civilian lives. It's something that you'd like to see replicated or extended. And it has sort of withered, but it has maintained my interest in World War II and the people who served in it.
Well, I think one of the things about World War II that we all love is the fact that it shows us Americans at their very best, their most united. It shows us what a country as diverse as this can actually do when it really puts its mind to achieving something of great, great significance. I wanted to thank you, David, for being with us. That was an awesome presentation. Max helped, but it was your narrative. Very generous of you to thank him and us, but it was a really great presentation. We'd love to see you in DC if you ever want to come and visit the memorial. I personally want to thank our audience. We have a really devoted group of viewers. They turn up once a month, every Saturday morning, when they could be doing something much more enjoyable than listen to me. But not quite as enjoyable as listening to you. But anyway, so thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you, David. Love to see you soon.
Welcome.
Best of luck with the next book.